While I was working on material on a future episode for Get the Power, I came across details talking about a brand new game based on the Robotech franchise, but strangely enough, the game never got released. At one point in time, years before titles like Robotech Battlecry, there was supposed to be what would have been regarded as one of the biggest undertakings of any anime franchise, but would inevitably kill the company that was producing it. How could such a game as this be such a huge risk? On this edition of The Uncommon Valley, we dive into the history of what might have been one of the best Nintendo 64 exclusives to never get finished. This is Robotech Crystal Dreams by GameTech. In 1991, Doug Lamford was able to finish his electrical engineering degree and would move to San Francisco's Bay Area, where he would get a job as a game tester for Sega of America. He would be hired on for game development for Sega's newest studio, then called the Sega Multimedia Studio, where he would help with programming for two different game releases in the form of Jurassic Park and Wild Woody. Even though both games made it to retail stores, both would underperform sale-wise and in part due to the Sega CD not gaining any ground in the market at that time. The studio would eventually fold, and Doug would be brought in to help for the Sega Saturn tech support not long after. Though while the game Wild Woody was in its final stages for finalizing its release, several of his former co-workers would leave the company and would join GameTech to begin working on a new project around that time. One that even Doug himself would be more than intrigued to work on, a game based on the Robotech anime series. And then on December 1995, GameTech would bring him in as another programmer and to offer some extra insight on the Robotech series as a whole to help with the design of the game, but to also use his knowledge of the anime itself to give it an authentic Robotech experience. When he began to get to work on the game itself, he wanted to scrap the whole project that was in place before he arrived, as it was supposed to be a prequel to the original Robotech series that was then called Robotech Academy. The original idea behind the game was it would allow the player to control a cadet as you were trying to improve their skills as a pilot and would eventually graduate from the Robotech Academy, hence the name of the game. When we interviewed Doug for the video, he remembers the first thing he did when he was being signed on to do the project. I was almost amused. Robotech Academy was how to make a Robotech game that has little to do with the fun bits of Robotech as possible. The entire game took place in simulated combat, with none of the familiar characters and little actual story. I took one look and tossed it. Robotech Academy lasted all about 2 weeks of development time. When development began for Crystal Dreams, the original plan was to put the game out around the holiday season of 1996. The same year that the Nintendo 64 would be out in store shelves. GameTech had hoped to make it a launch title, but with the team starting the original project all over from the start, the new date would be pushed to a later date with the then new title name, Robotech Crystal Dreams. The idea for the new title came from him and his co-workers who were trying to figure out how powerful the graphics that they could push for the N64's hardware to, and decided on an enemy type in the form of crystals. And without much debate, they both agreed on the new title for the game. While at the start of development, GameTech had certain restrictions in place to make it accessible for both Japan and US markets. All the while, with Lamford and crew wanted to make sure the game would stay true to the original source material, they had a lot of ideas for the game that would, in the long run, become far too ambitious of a project. Ideas being used for the game itself was to be a full-on flight sim on par with games like Star Wars, X-Wing, and TIE Fighter series, and the Wing Commander series, to making the game be made as an open world style game where the player could fly around anywhere they wanted while being able to accept a variety of missions that would pop up at random. It would also affect the player based on certain actions they display during missions. Like if you were to accept a mission to protect convoys, but decided to abandon it in the middle of an attack, the game would either reward you or harm your overall reputation based on how the overall mission went. All of this would be a part of the idea that the game would have many different missions for the player to select from, and we're working on a random mission generator for it, and even purchase item upgrades at various shops by using credits they obtain from those same missions. The word about this project got out to various publications, and even Nintendo was getting in the hype with issue 86 of Nintendo Power, which featured the game and included a full-length poster in every issue. GameTech used some pre-rendered shots from in-game for various publications before Nintendo 64 name was finalized, but after Doug joined the team, the rest of the time the game was being advertised in various publications were all from in-game. This would in turn make Crystal Dreams go from an interesting idea for a game to what many magazines at the time described as being one of the most highly anticipated titles for the console, and was determined even more to get the new game out. But for GameTech, it would eventually lead to its inevitable downfall. In 1997, GameTech would file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and would be able to continue publishing software due in part to companies like Take-Two Interactive, and some cash that the company needed to continue to operate. While good for the company, it would not help the progression of the Robotech project. The more the game was being worked on, and the more ambitious and hyped up the game was getting, turning that once crystal dream of a game into a glass-shattering nightmare for the team. This would cause serious doubts within the team as they thought the broad scope of the game that it wouldn't match up to the hype, and even with how much funds that they had available to continue development. That was until a very unlikely source in the form of Capcom came to GameTech in hopes of helping out with distributing the game here in the States, while another company in the form of Tomy would handle Japan on its release. While it seems like a good enough offer, there was one major setback. Neither of the two companies wanted to agree to help with funding for the project itself, and wanted nothing to do with the money that GameTech was bleeding from all the development. It was because of this very reason that both Capcom and Tomy would unfortunately bail out of the deal, leaving both GameTech and the Crystal Dreams project in permanent limbo. While things seemed rather grim for GameTech as a whole, Doug Lamford continued to keep programming and making more progress without knowing the company was facing potential closure by saying the following: "I didn't realize GameTech was in trouble until the day I showed up at work and was told people would be leading us individually to our desks to collect our belongings. I had an idea that things were a little rough for a month or so before that, but didn't think GameTech was on the edge of closing its doors. The sad thing was we had just finally got to a point that we were starting to see what the actual gameplay might be like." He was not wrong. The game was around 8 to 9 months left of development time, and wanted to do everything they could to get this into people's hands as soon as possible. So they put together one final ditch effort for a demo and brought it over to Capcom in hopes of being able to show it off behind closed doors for the press to report on what they were able to see. Some that had the chance to play the demo that was presented was met with mixed reviews, ranging anywhere from intrigue to just straight up confusion and disappointment. It was at this point for Lamford and his team that the project would be scrapped of any further development. Even though the project never got to see its full conclusion in getting released, Doug Lamford pointed out one of the very reasons why no company wanted to do anything with an attempt to completing this hopeful project. At a guess, I think people didn't quite get the game. We were trying something different that had been done on consoles up to that point. Robotech Crystal Dreams was a space combat sim like some of the PC games at the time, but with a fully open world. It just wasn't a simple arcade pick-up and play game. There was a big learning curve to use all the controls, mapped to a single N64 controller. After this, the rest of the original team split, and Doug would work for 3DO developing various software all up until 3DO's initial closing in May of 2003. Since then, Doug moved back to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he developed a variety of games for mobile devices for a company called Mr. Owl. There's no telling how successful and popular Crystal Dreams would have become had the game been finalized and released at the time of the Nintendo 64. But it has become a sad and unfortunate tale of a project that never was given the chance to be completed. Whether it was because it combined too many things to make it over-bloated, or the lack of any additional fundings in the end, Crystal Dreams would become a sad tale of what could have been one of the biggest releases for any console at the time. And for any final comments to describe the overall experience with the project, Doug would leave it with this final statement. Getting to play at being a game designer for a game based on a favorite animated series was great. With such a small development team, it often seemed like progress of the actual gameplay elements always took a backseat to building the game engine we plan to use for Robotech Crystal Dreams in future games. To have the sudden bankruptcy just as we finally started moving to building the gameplay hurt. It's still a highlight of my career, but to never see it completed was deeply frustrating. That's it for this edition of The Uncommon Valley. Thank you again to Doug Lamford for his interview, and also thank you for watching as we look to the past into the present.